So it's important to realize that before World War II, the US is still going through the Great Depression. So the New Deal policies of Franklin Roosevelt are very popular with the American people, but it's not enough to get the US out of the economic depression. Interestingly enough, it would take World War II to finally lift the United States out of the Great Depression. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, but ironically enough, would also have a part in starting World War II. Germany was under immense economic hardship, and that's because in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was blamed for all of the damages caused during World War I, and as a result, it was made responsible for paying war reparations for the damages that it had done during World War I. So, as there was no way it could possibly pay for all of the war damages, the country suffered from hyperinflation, and this made its currency worthless. Germany desperately needed a leader that could restore national pride and solve their economic woes. Meanwhile, the League of Nations, which was abandoned by the United States, was powerless to prevent conflicts in Europe and around the world, and lacking a strong, influential country to help it maintain peace. The US was not the only country suffering from economic hardship at this time. Much of the world was experiencing severe economic times, and countries were desperate to find leaders who could make their lives better. In this desperation, dictators arose who promised their people better times once they came to power. So, Joseph Stalin became the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler would become the Nazi dictator of Germany, and Benito Mussolini would become the fascist dictator of Italy. In Japan, Japan was ruled by an emperor, but much of the power was with their military leader, a man named Hideki Tojo. Japan had industrialized very quickly and had become the strongest industrial power in Asia. They had also built a powerful, modernized military and used it to invade China, and in the early 1900s also defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. It's important to remember that because Japan is an island, they depended on resources outside their territory to help maintain their industrial status. And this is the reason why they invaded China and in the early 1900s went to war against Russia. They needed natural resources to power their industrial complex. So, what was the United States doing during this time of turmoil in Europe? Well, the United States was primarily isolationist. So, even as Europe was going through a period of turmoil, the US stayed out of European affairs, not wanting to be dragged into another foreign war like what had happened during World War I. So, under the Neutrality Acts, the United States was forbidden to sell weapons and supplies to European countries. Later on, as the war progressed in Europe, as France and Great Britain would become under attack by the Germans, the United States would pass something called the Lend-Lease Act, and that would allow them to lend and lease military supplies to its allies for basically free. This got around the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s. Right before World War II, some important events are going to happen in Europe, and they are going to be started by Germany. Germany would begin to take territory under the military leadership of Adolf Hitler. It would begin by annexing an area called the Sudetenland. This is the area on the map that you see here that's outlined in red. The reason why Hitler wanted this territory was because many people that lived there were of German descent, and they lived in this area, and Hitler felt it was only right that Germany have rights to this land. Even though this violated the Versailles Treaty, the French and British governments and their leaders allowed Germany to take this land in order to avoid war. This was known as appeasement. You give up something even though it might not be the best thing to do in order to avoid war. Hitler also promised that he had no more territorial ambitions, that he would not take any other territory. This, of course, was a lie. One of the things also that happened right before the war was that Hitler would begin his military campaign in Europe, but he decided that what he needed to do first was to make peace with Russia. And in the political cartoon here, you can see Stalin on the left with a gun behind his back, shaking hands with Adolf Hitler, who is on the right, who also has a gun behind his back. And both of them have one foot on Poland. What this shows is that neither leader really trusts each other, but the agreement is going to be that they will both get a share of Poland. So the thinking behind this from Adolf Hitler's point of view is that, first of all, he did not want to fight another two-front war like what happened in World War I. Hitler decided to sign what was known as a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and Stalin. Hitler said he would take Poland and then later on during the World War would split the Polish territory between himself and Stalin. Stalin agreed to the pact and did not worry about Hitler's attack on Poland, knowing that they had signed a non-aggression pact. So in 1939, Hitler begins his campaign in Europe. Germany attacked Poland and easily overtook it. His use of a new fighting strategy that was known as the Blitzkrieg, which was a combination of airplanes and tanks, was unstoppable, and Poland was easily defeated. France and Great Britain, seeing that Hitler was not going to stop his aggression in Europe, declared war on Germany, and World War II had begun. France is going to be the next victim of Germany. German forces were able to easily overcome the French forces. And what Germany could not accomplish in all of World War I, that is, the taking over of France, now only took them a few weeks. Britain was the last remaining democratic country at this time during the war, and they were the only ones that had yet to be defeated by Hitler's army. Britain, being an island, was not easy to attack, so Hitler decided that nightly air raids would be the best way to defeat the British. This was known as the Blitz. Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at this time, would encourage his people not to lose hope and to never surrender. And Hitler was never able to take over Britain during the war, even in the face of these massive bombings. 1941 is going to be an important turning point in the war. Hitler is going to try something that other leaders from other countries in the past had never succeeded in, and that is attacking and taking Russia. So in 1941, this would be the year that the war would begin to change. And in about face, Hitler is going to violate his non-aggression pact with Stalin, and he's going to invade Russia. Hitler, being a Nazi, hated Stalin, he hated communism, and hoped to take over the western part of Russia to provide more living space for the German people. Even Stalin could not believe that Hitler had violated the non-aggression pact and that his country was being invaded. And finally, another reason why 1941 is so important is because of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, which happened on December 7th, 1941. So the Japanese saw the US as a rivalry in the Pacific and a barrier to them dominating in the Pacific and Asia. The US had increased its presence in Asia since the Spanish-American War. So if the Japanese could deliver a fatal blow to the US military fleet at Pearl Harbor, perhaps the United States would become demoralized and remove itself from the Pacific. So Japanese planes traveled in complete radio silence across the Pacific and under the detection of radar. It would be a surprise attack on the US naval base in Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese would sink 18 warships. But this is important. US aircraft carriers and US submarines were not there, or they were not in the place where the Japanese thought they would be when they started the bombing. And the Japanese did not have enough fuel to look for them. This mistake by the Japanese allowed the United States to recover faster than if the aircraft carriers and the submarines had been sunk. Also, the ships that had been targeted and destroyed were destroyed in shallow water. And what this means is that it made it easier for the US military to bring them out of the water, repair them, and get them ready for fighting in a very short period of time. So on December 8th, the next day, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt declares war on Japan. Now, Japan and Germany were allies, and 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany declares war on the United States.